My name is Lauren. I'm an MLIS grad student and the Student Advocacy President at San Jose State University. I, like many other students, have been watching the world respond to the issue that severely impacts the industry that many students like myself are hoping to enter. Admittedly, it looks pretty bleak. That's why I decided to put out a call to get the perspective of real-life experienced librarians today, to hear their side of the story. Even though
an angry guy called me, but it was really funny.
Full voice. I'm like, I thought it was the same thing.
Not a single person.
Yeah, exactly. This is good. This is a good time to graduate now. Yeah, that's so cool. Well, thanks for letting me know.
What I say is have them read the book.
I've been active with the Pennsylvania Library Association since I've started working in Pennsylvania, and intellectual freedom has always been a passion of mine. So when there was an opening on that particular committee, I was like, please pick me. And so for the last several years, I've been on that committee, mainly because we wanted to provide a rural and small library voice on that committee, because it's different getting a challenge in a rural and small library than it is in the large libraries. It's usually somebody you know, like it's your neighbor. You don't have that same anonymity. And it usually is quicker for there to be challenges to funding and things like that in a small area, because there's those personal relationships that allow that challenge. So I don't know how we've managed to avoid a challenge, but somehow we have. And so we've been focusing very much on making sure that we have policies that are up to date, but are also flexible, training our boards, because we know that board support is going to be absolutely essential when inevitably there is a challenge. And we've seen other libraries that be the stumbling block. They had the policy. It was getting the board to follow the policy when faced with pressure from the public. And so between the Pennsylvania Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee, and then I'm also involved in the Association for Rural and Small Libraries Advocacy Committee, which does a lot with bans and challenges. We've been providing some support for libraries when they are facing challenges, just helping them talk through it or navigate tools they may need or resources that may be available and things like that.
I've spoken with different people that have explained that having a plan is the most important thing, because obviously if you're prepared versus if you're not, and then you're like caught off guard. The other thing I've heard is it's often certain groups of people that are very mobilized that aren't necessarily locals even, that come to areas that stir things up. I mean, it's nice you haven't had to deal with that so much. How about in your school libraries? You haven't either.
We've had a couple of small incidents in the school libraries. The first thing that came up is just at the beginning of COVID, when the school closures first began, the counselor offered an LGBTQ journal to students that were interested. They would send it to their home. And there's a ridiculous number of school districts in a county our size. I don't know why there's so many, but there are. And so this particular one is really rural out there. It's probably the furthest from the larger cities that we have. And there was some uproar about that from parents, which isn't surprising. That's exactly where I would expect there to be a challenge. That one died down fairly quickly because the school board was able to quickly state that this obviously isn't mandatory. This obviously isn't being pushed on them. It's something being offered to them if they want it, and that's it. So that worked out pretty well. So what I've been observing in libraries is that, yes, there are people making challenges, and they usually come in with a list of books that they were given from an organization or some other group that has kind of informed them. But also what we're seeing is them taking over school boards, like infiltrating the school boards. That infiltrating makes it sound dubious, but they're making a concerted effort to run for offices so that when inevitably a challenge does come, the decisions being made will be very different than what they may have been previously. And also curriculum decisions will be much more limited than they would have been previously. So we are seeing a lot of that happening locally. There's one gentleman who ran for school board, one of the districts, and they had this whole argument because he owns land in that area, but he doesn't actually live on that land. So was he really eligible to run? That kind of thing. And he was making very inflammatory statements online while he was running to be on that school board. And they seemed to be informed by those organized groups we've talked about before. Ultimately, he did not win his seat, thank goodness. But there are other people on each of the boards that are definitely listening to those more organized groups and making very bold statements and proposals. At the moment, they do not have a majority, but it probably won't take long before they do if things continue the way they are. As for challenging actual materials, if there have been challenges to school materials, the school boards have kept it very quiet and there hasn't been much press or much notice about that. Their meetings are open to the public, but the reporting back from them hasn't demonstrated that there's been concerted challenges so far somehow.
I'm in Huntington Beach, California, and so I've talked to other people about how we are a red county / city in an otherwise blue state. So it's been interesting to see certain decisions that have been being made. A lot of talk about parental rights when it comes to book choices. It can go hand in hand with some misinformation about what kinds of books are in school libraries or allotted to children and teenagers. Our city voted against having any flags that are not the state or U.S. flag. So it's very pointed in a way, you know.
I have to say, I will give them credit for going that direction and just removing everything but those two instead of just targeting specifically what we know they probably were targeting. That's surprising.
Because then it's like, well, we just want the official flags, you know. Like, okay, all right. Hopefully, it won't be like this forever. Like online, I'm sure you're aware. Like libraries and such, at least in my area, have had more negative comments from people making accusations, etc. At least around June, if no other month. I almost also feel like a year ago it would have been more about the critical race theory stuff that people are talking about, and not that that's gone away, but I feel like it's a little bit shifted to more.
Yeah, it's definitely very anti-trans directed in a lot of the things I'm seeing. That seems to be a focal point. We are in an incredibly non-diverse area. We're probably 97% Eastern European Caucasian. What little diversity we have comes from a teaching hospital nearby, and they don't stay for long. They come for the residency or the traveling nurses, and they're here for a couple of years and then they leave. I think that's a detriment to our community personally, because I think it's an opportunity for us to learn more about the world and each other. But we don't have a lot of conversations about race because it's easy for them to avoid those conversations when there's not a lot of people around who represent that experience. And that's unfortunate. We are fortunate. One of our system libraries, the one that's closest to that teaching hospital, they're able to get away with more progressive programming than some of the other libraries would be able to get away with because of their proximity to the hospital and their proximity to more resources. They're closer to the New York border and things like that. So they have a teen reading lounge and they focused on racial injustice because the youth chose to. They chose that topic themselves. And it was well received. I'm sure there was a negative comment here and there, but nothing that rose to the occasion of, we need to think about this. And I think last year I think 2023, they did environmental topics. And again, the teens are the ones that chose the topic. It helped that it was teen led, I think. But I think it also really helped us that it was that specific library. If it had been one of the others, it definitely would have been dicier. I think I mentioned to you, we partner a lot, the library system partners a lot with the Regional Arts Council, and they have tried to be a lot more upfront about diversity topics, particularly LGBTQIA. And so we partnered with them on a documentary about the rural experience and on Pride Proclamation and some Pride Month activities. We were able to do it as a system because it was more general. The only library that specifically was able to partner on it was that one that's up there near the border and so forth. The smaller libraries, not so much. I suspect part of why we didn't get a lot of pushback from those communities is because they probably aren't following the Regional Arts Council to begin with. So they probably didn't realize it was occurring. The hospital that I mentioned, they started their first EDI group last year, and they had reached out to those involved in the documentary and in the Pride Month planning for us to give some feedback. They're a pretty large hospital system for them to just now be doing any kind of diversity stuff, but we'll take it. And they got pushback online when they announced that they were providing a lot more diversity inclusion forward endeavors. Like, for example, on their website, you can select doctors who have self-identified as LGBTQ friendly for the first time ever. And that's a great step. And I'm so proud that they did it. But when they announced that, there were hateful comments immediately. I'm not surprised that there are people following the hospital that are not following the Regional Arts Council. So Pride Month, they did raise a flag on campus, their first ever with the Pride flag. Reasonably well attended, not a ton of backlash, but definitely some crappy comments, but there were no protesters or anything. And then they co-sponsored 2 Pride events in New York where they could get away with it, where there actually are Pride events. A couple of negative comments, but for the most part, it was left pretty alone. The partnership that the libraries had with the Regional Arts Council for Pride Month this year, we co-sponsored the proclamation. It's the first proclamation, but we didn't have any issues this year. And we were able to host, we didn't co-sponsor them, but were involved in the planning of 4 Pride events. They did a Pride Color Run, and they did have a drag event, but it was at night and it was family friendly. And the drag performer, she was involved in RuPaul's Drag Race, not the drag race, but the camp they did. And
Okay.
and she came back to the area. She got some crappy comments on that, but for the most part, it was just, why is it family friendly? And she said, well, it's just open to all ages, but it's at 8 o'clock at night. So I don't imagine there's going to be unaccompanied minors here. And the only children there were family members of the performer. And it was their first time, her entire family's first time seeing her perform in drag. So that was really cool because she performs in New Orleans and Orlando and stuff. She's gotten pretty popular out there. And then there was a play, but it didn't have LGBT themes, but one of the stars in it was a drag queen performing as a woman. There was a musical singer-songwriter that came that is trans. It was not advertised that way, but she did mention it on stage, but very well received. But again, the people who would have had a problem probably weren't coming to a singer-songwriter at 8 o'clock at the arts council kind of thing. We played it a little safe, advertising what we were doing, not shying away from it being Pride, but only using our usual circles of communication rather than going out of our way to promote, hey, we're doing Pride stuff kind of thing. But that was more from a safety standpoint. I am surprised we didn't have more comments. I expected someone to say, why was the library involved in this? And so far that hasn't happened. I'm not sure if they just didn't notice or what, but we've been very fortunate in that regard. But I'm sure it's just a matter of time.
You kind of hope that things have been turning a corner, and it's kind of hard to judge. Like, I would imagine that it'd be easier to be an LGBTQ teenager, for example, now than when I was a teenager, I would imagine. But then there's so many factors that determine whether it is actually easier for you, specifically if you were that teenager versus not, including where you live and your district and your family and all of that.
The rural areas are always a little bit behind on the ideas. And they're always like, well, that happens in big cities. But so maybe uninformed, don't realize that they do know people from that community who are just keeping it quiet for their own safety. I think in rural communities, it is still scary and difficult to come out. That was part of why we wanted to be involved in the film with the Regional Arts Council, because it is focused on stories for county, because we felt like giving it a face and a voice that was familiar would be helpful. And not just to educate other people, but also to let the youth know that you're not alone and you do have supporters here and allies here. I think it helped us that that was our first project and that we made it clear from the very beginning that we weren't looking to change minds, that we were just looking to inform people and to, I think the way she put it was, we're not here to change minds, we're here to soften hearts. And I think that was a effective messaging that was helpful. I wonder with these organized groups like Moms for Liberty and these other groups that we know are spreading lists and organizing tips and so forth, it's easier for them to get a stronghold in larger communities where there's more people and so forth. Whereas the smaller communities who may easily accept the ideas that they're spreading are a little harder to reach. They're less likely to be online or possibly less informed, maybe just too busy trying to survive to be aware of things that are going on. I was surprised when Central York here in Pennsylvania had so many book challenges. Like they had like 800 for the school district. Central York is not rural. They're not a conservative area. I don't understand, but it seems like they were just able to find the right people and say the right words to really target and trigger them and cause an issue. It was the kind of response I would have expected from a small rural area where you're going to have a lot of people who know each other and feel like, well, he's saying that this is happening and I know him, so therefore it's true. And I'm going to go with him because I don't want him to think that I'm on the other side. In a larger community, it's easier to opt out of being involved. In a smaller community, you feel more peer pressure to be involved. So I'm not quite sure how that all played out, how that happened. But we do know that there's a lot of organizing going on through churches, unfortunately, and other religious groups, and that's spreading that message. Maybe in rural communities, we're less likely to have a large church that is involved politically with things, and that may be why the message isn't spreading quite the same. I'm not sure. I'm amazed every day that haven't had more issues. Every day I wait for the phone call from one of the libraries saying, okay, it's happening.
Somebody was saying that, for example, oftentimes you have the process set in place where you have somebody comes to complain about a book, you give them a form or something that says, I've read it, I know this is where the problem is. Like, the more steps you give somebody to have to go through, the less likely they are to actually continue with the process. And that can include even having to go to board meetings. Like, it's easy to say, oh, the kids are being groomed or something, and use that as like a flame. Yeah, if you're in an area where you're being told this sort of thing all of the time, then it's easier to just assume, of course, this is happening, and this is bad, and then people come and read portions of books where they only read
Out of
selections
context.
out
Yeah.
of context. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm lucky, I guess. I grew up in rural East Texas. We moved a lot, but by the time I was in high school, we had settled into the town my dad had grown up in. And my first exposure to book banning and intellectual freedom challenges, other than Tipper Gore and music, which was at its height back then, which tells you how old I am. But my freshman year, the honors history class, one of the assigned books was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, but they had the option of reading a different book instead. And to my knowledge, one person challenged it and their parents doubled down on it. It became a really big issue. I wasn't in that class, but I was friends with a lot of the people and we had other classes together. And as soon as my mom heard about it, she was like, absolutely not. Have you read this book? And I'm like, no, I haven't. And we didn't buy books. We were poor. We went to the library, but we didn't have a library there. We're in the middle of nowhere. She went out and actually purchased a copy of the book. Her and I both read it. We talked about it. And that was very much her response to it was, you know, have these people read it? And then she's standing in the pharmacy paying the gas bill because small town. And there's a group of old men standing around talking about it. And they were like, ma'am, have you read this much? And she was like, actually, I have. Have you? And they were like, oh, I would never. And she's like, well, I really think you should. It's an excellent book, and classic my mom, talking about, it talks so much about being a woman and being, poor and being a racial minority in the South and, da 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 da. And they're like, but it talks about a rape scene. And she's like, you keep mentioning that. Have you read it? And, it's from the perspective of a 5-year-old and it's very appropriately what a 5-year-old would say. And, it's a memoir, right? Are you telling this person she can't tell what happened in her real life? So her example to me was really transformative because it was just head on confronting and very quickly realizing that the hoopla about it was very much misinformation and lack of information. And it eventually, the challenge went nowhere, as you would expect. But for me, it set a tone that anytime I'd hear about a challenge after that, I'd be like, here we go again. I bet they haven't read it. I bet they haven't thought about the context and everything. And sure enough, half the challenges we see, that's what happens is, of course, I didn't read it. Why would I read this? Be like, well, if you did, you'd understand why that passage is in there and what part it plays in the book. I think that's a valuable thing for the reconsideration policies and procedures, which is usually my focus is on the formation of the policies and procedures and the training, because thankfully we haven't had to deal with an actual challenge recently. But it's important that the reconsideration policy or the form asks them about whether or not they've read it. And if the board will agree to stating that if they state they haven't read it, the conversation is over, that can be valuable. And also limiting them on, if you're not a resident of the service area of this, I care that you have strong feelings, but it doesn't change what the library is going to do because you're not the tax base that we're appealing to. When they have a complaint, then yes, we will take it differently. And then also the question of not only have you read it and are you a resident of the area, but are your objections based on, if you're saying that it needs to be in a different shelving area, for example, there may be a very valid reason and you may be absolutely correct. And that's great. But if you're saying no one can read it, now we've got a problem. One of the questions I've seen asked on some effective policies is, how did you become aware of this book? And I think that can give you some real insight because when they say this political person I follow sent me a list, you automatically know where this is going. I'm not saying you immediately say, no, we're not going to consider it now, but it does give you some perspective on the kinds of arguments they're going to make and the ways you're going to need to respond. And that can be beneficial in that regard. A well-crafted policy and procedure and a board and staff that is willing to follow it to the T, even when they don't agree with the decision. There's plenty of things in the library that I personally would not read, nor would I let my 5-year-old granddaughter read, nor would I have in my home. But that's okay. They're just not for me. And that's the distinction we need those board members to make, is that self-determination is one thing, determining for other people is quite another. And that's a line we can't be in a position to cross. I think it's also important that they put limits on how often a single individual can make challenges, like, and how many titles they can challenge at once, and then how soon a item that has gone through the process can be re-challenged, because they're using up a lot of resources and it's creating a nuisance to some degree. If the item's already been challenged or you're asking us to challenge a large number of titles, it's a big resource drain that's just not conducive of our time and resources.
I think somebody I spoke to was saying that if a book has gone through all of the steps and is decided to be kept, then they're not allowed to touch it for like a year or something like that. I don't remember. But it was like if it went through all of the proper channels and everyone went, it's fine, then okay.
Yeah, and I've heard of ones that they say we're not doing this again for 3 years or 5 years or
Right, yeah,
because
yeah.
what significantly would have changed in that time?
Yeah, the book, how did the book change? We have a huge range of what your students can choose and what your kids can choose. Everything in the library was selected to be age appropriate for different demographics, etc. If you wouldn't like a certain type of book in your home, like you have to have that talk with your child. Like we're not the ones who are going to limit them after we've already gone through this process. You can have that talk with your kids, and that's great.
Well, there's some really interesting conversations going on about what rights do children have in self-determination. If a child comes up to you and is talking about dating violence or anything like that, and they're looking for books that talk about that, a parent may say anything that has to do with dating or sex is off limits. If they're asking about it, they're being exposed to it somehow. Either they have a friend who's going through it or something and they have questions. And as a librarian, that's what we do. We connect people with information, age appropriate, but we connect them with information. And so are we violating a child's right to access information by saying, well, I just can't help you with that? We don't want to replace the parent by any stretch. We want the parent to be involved, but the parent's not standing there, the parent's not answering their question. Do we give them an indication of where those books can be located, or do we say, no, that's not for you? Like it puts us in a really sticky position. We're not child psychologists, we're librarians. Our job is access to information, not limitations on information. And so it's really hairy. And one thing I like to consider is, this is true of a lot of librarians, but I was a very precocious reader. I didn't read kids' books except for school. I was reading what my sisters and my mom was reading. I mean, that meant reading Stephen King and V.C. Andrews when I was, 8 or 9. Like my whole generation was like that. We read these really wild things that were, looking back, probably grossly inappropriate, but we're okay. And the difference is my mom knew what I was reading and we could talk about it. We could have conversations about it. And she had an insight into what my specific triggers were and what my emotional maturity level was and what things she didn't want me having access to for whatever reasons. And so for me, not being a parent myself, I'm trying to be cautious about what I would do if I was a parent. I think that the person who is best qualified to make those kinds of determinations about what is appropriate for each individual child is the parent or caregiver, because they do have the insights into that child's emotional maturity and their triggers and stuff like that. What I was reading at 8 versus what my little brother was reading at 8, very different things. And it was because of our individual abilities and interests. And you compare that to what my mom was reading at age 8, or, my grandmother was reading at age 8. It's very different. It's because we're individuals. And librarians can't know all of those factors, but a parent or caregiver can. So we can't be a substitute for the parental guidance. It's not a reasonable request.
I have spoken to school librarians as well who've been like, well, parental rights versus child rights, right? And for example, in schools where there have been more challenges, etc., some parents have tried to get teacher librarians to like write lists of what their kids are looking at or different things, and they're like, well, they have their own right to choose books, and I'm not going to tell you what they're picking. Like, if you want to have that talk to them, that's different. All kinds of reasons why preteens are being secretive about what they're reading. It's not necessarily malicious. It's like embarrassment or hormones or all sorts of reasons. For any kind of material, I always think, wouldn't you rather them pick like a book, especially in the children's section, but in general, like versus any of them, the swaths of internet material you could accidentally come across.
Exactly. At least someone with some knowledge was involved in choosing appropriate materials. Online, it's a free-for-all. And the misinformation angle, like we know kids are interested in sex and all these other topics because we were kids. We know what it's like. Those conversations are happening at the craziest ages. They're going to get a lot of misinformation from their peers. We have to provide that information that is valid because they do need to know. Whether we like it or not, they are going to experiment. We want them to be armed with correct information. And they're not always going to feel comfortable asking their parent for that. I mean, plus we know you never believe your mom's right. You got to hear it from somebody else before it's true. So we need to have those resources available to them so that they are protected from dating violence or various other things that they may have questions about. We see it with eating disorders and mental health issues in particular. They're not comfortable talking to someone else about it yet, even someone like their parent. We can't deny them access to that information because of the danger it places them in. So all we can do is have age appropriate and as factual as possible materials available. And we can't violate their privacy by telling their parents that's what they're checking out. I mean, their parents would have a cow if we released to the media everything they've ever checked out. So it's not that different.
It is definitely also like a shift in how we view, like you were saying, children's rights, like how we view children as being their own beings versus just extensions of their parents or whatever. And
All right. Well, and we know that a child, we're mandated reporters in libraries, or at least in Pennsylvania. And we know that sometimes it's easier to speak to someone who is not your direct family member because when it comes to eating disorders, mental health, sexual violence, all these various things, there's shame involved and there's fear involved. And so having someone that you can send some of the signals to so that they can get you help is so important. And all of these limitations are creating a greater and greater slippery slope where it makes us where they are feeling even more isolated. And that's the last thing we want to do for anybody, adults too. My boyfriend will ask me, he's like, well, I mean, what if somebody came in and wanted to know about books about bombs? And I'm like, okay. And he's like, but they could use it to make a bomb. I'm like, or they could be a nerd like me and you who wants to know how it works. Or they could be a writer who is trying to make sure that the scene they're writing is going to be accurate. Like, I'm not responsible for their intent. They're asking me for information. I'm making sure they get accurate information. Of course, I don't want them to use it to hurt somebody and to create a bomb, but I don't know. I can't assume that's what it's for. And so that's a weird gray area that we operate in where we have to protect their privacy, but also keep in mind the safety of the public. And it's a really gray area we struggle with. I don't want the public to know that. We don't need them mad at us about something else, but it's another gray area we're constantly in. And who gets to determine what information is appropriate for the public to have? The United States Constitution says nobody gets to decide that. It passes the Miller test, it passes. And so far, everything's passed the Miller's test, more or less. So it's allowed. What you do with it, I can't control. So it's a lot about personal responsibility and also personal right to access information. And I worry, we've just had a joint Intellectual Freedom Committee and EDI committee presentation, and we had 3 presenters that had book bans, and they were talking about their experience. It was a really great conversation. And one of the things that came up was, our library is really neutral, and is neutral the right word? Because the one person said that, well, regardless of where the challenge is coming from, I feel like as a librarian, I have to listen to their perspective. And it's like hearing what they have to say and going through the process is very different. And someone said, and our library is neutral. Would we put books in our collection that were advocating hatred and violence toward a group? Would we do that? And neutrality implies that yes, we would. But reality is, would we? And so is neutral the right word in this conversation? We're human beings. We're inherently not neutral. So I think there's a lot of conversations that will be happening in library land in the wake of the political climate we've been in about what it means in collection development and in all of these other things of, are we really neutral, and is that a reasonable expectation?
it makes me think of, I mean, just social media in general, right? Like these are just talks that are on every social media platform. And like YouTube, like I was thinking, if someone's worried about a bomb tutorial, I'm like, well, I'm sure there's 5, 50, whatever on YouTube, and you can watch them do it. The funny thing with Twitter or X now is like Elon Musk wants to be like, oh, there are no rules. Like, I'm cooler than the other social media platforms. You can say whatever you want. And then you realize pretty quickly,
as long as it follows his.
Yeah, exactly. And like, if you just let people do whatever they want, it becomes a little bit of chaos when there are no exceptions. Even if the exceptions that he chooses are more like if they make fun of me or something, and
If
not
they hurt
like,
my feelings,
and
then
not,
no. But if they hurt her feelings,
yeah, and that's fine.
my friend has a cousin that is a very, I mean, he's literally traveled the world backpacking and that kind of thing, has done every drug known to man and whatever. And he's very anti-government. He's very like, nobody gets to decide for me and da da da. I'd be like, okay, that's great. And he's like, and there should be no laws. And we're like, here's my concern about that. Do you want to be able to walk down the street and know that someone is not going to attack you? And if they do, that there's going to be repercussions to that. Well, of course, that's laws. That's government. Part of agreeing to be part of society is that you give up a little bit of your personal freedom for the greater safety of the goal. So not only can you not just decide that you want to hurt somebody, but they also can't just decide they want to hurt you without repercussions. There's always going to be that. There's always this push and pull. And we want to be as vague with that, as general with that as possible, because circumstances change. There's a lot of nuance involved. And the person in charge has their own agenda that can influence what that looks like. And that's a problem. It's too easy to slip into an authoritarian situation if we begin banning or restricting access to, well, it's just that group. Okay, well, next it's going to be, and also this one, and also this one. And then where do we go? And that's why the idea that librarians usually try to stick with is we don't want to go down that road at all. So we're not restricting access to anything. The conversations I've had with people that are more interested in book banning, when we've been able to calmly talk about, well, what are your concerns about this? Well, where did you hear that? And is that actually happening? Like the litter box conversation. Oy vey. I had someone who I believed to be fairly well informed and reasonable say something about it. And I was like, where is that happening? Well, I heard it was happening here. Okay, is it happening there? Like, can you confirm that? And once we could talk about that, we'd be like, the media doesn't have restrictions on it. They're not required to tell the truth. Every media outlet gives a little bit of spin by what they choose to cover, by how they cover it, by how much they cover it. So it's always going to be a little skewed. So before you just believe wholeheartedly, you have a personal responsibility to verify and to check and to ask yourself, why is that group telling me that this is the case? What do they have to gain from that? You know, just a little bit of personal forethought or involvement in it. The litter box thing has been proven not to be true anywhere. Yet there's still people saying it every day. And you know, this grooming idea and pedophilia idea and all this, we know from scientific research that people in the LGBTQ community are no more likely to be pedophiles than a member of the straight community. In fact, the numbers may be slightly lower. Where does that idea come from? And there's no indication that you can turn someone gay. I mean, I read books about straight couples my entire life, and I still was married to a woman for 10 years. They didn't turn me straight. And so there's no reason to think that reading about gay characters would turn a straight person gay. Like it doesn't, the psychology and the data is not there to support that argument. And that's why we need to be careful, because it's demonizing people and marginalizing them further. And it forces us not to be neutral, but it's a stance that we have to take, that libraries are for everyone, even the people that you don't know, even the people you don't agree with, and even the people you don't like. It makes a scary world out there, though. You never know, who is it going to be tomorrow? And how many people are going to be attacked or doxxed or something else and have their lives ruined because someone's decided that something they said or supported is against their personal values. It's scary.
Yeah, I think that's where the beliefs become dangerous, right? It's when people were saying, I don't believe in this because XYZ or this because of that, versus instigating this idea that it's this malicious force that's trying to get children. Then, of course, people will flock to your side out of fear, but then they will lash out, because if you're being told that some evil person is doing something to children and you're going to just do nothing about it, like
any idea or group or faith or whatever, extremes exist in all of these realms. And there are people who take it too far. They get a little too down the rabbit hole. And I don't personally understand why it's easier to believe that there is some organized cabal that is trying to destroy everything than it is to believe that human beings by nature have their own personal agendas and their own personal fears and beliefs, and sometimes they act on them, and that causes things to happen. The number of people it would take to organize a cabal to control the world, I don't believe that they could all agree. I just don't. I think it's more likely that here and there are bad people who do bad things, or well-intentioned people who do things with unintended consequences. That just seems more reasonable to me. I don't want to live in a world that somebody's a puppet master controlling everything, you know? At least if it's just a few people making decisions I don't quite understand, there's a chance of that changing.
If it is this evil puppet master idea, then we don't have any responsibility for anything going on.
Isn't that convenient? Yeah, I think there's a personal responsibility angle that gets involved. I mean, it's like that. It's against your faith to do a thing. Okay, that's for you, but I'm not a member of that faith. It's not against my faith to do that thing. Those are two different things now. It's like, you can't tell me that I can't have a cookie because you're on a diet or, whatever else. Like, it's a stupid comparison, but it's accurate. Like, it's wrong for you. It's immoral for you, but not for everyone else. And, if people are like, I think this book's inappropriate for kids, you're absolutely entitled to that opinion. And it may be inappropriate for some kids, and that's fine. But when you extend it to, and now no kid can have it, that's when it's a problem. You don't get to do that. There's too many other personal rights and perspectives and everything else going on. I think for libraries, if we can keep the conversation about book challenges in the realm of our job is to provide access, and we don't want to limit an individual's rights to make decisions for themselves. And we don't think it's appropriate for anyone to. And we do not want to infringe on a parent's rights to make decisions for their child. Then we have a better chance of winning the argument because we are reaffirming their individual rights, but we're not taking a side that makes us the enemy. It's very much in that libertarian vein of no one should be able to tell you what to do. When we lean more toward that direction, I think it's a little more tenable for a large number of people.
That makes sense. The idea of like, well, you don't want, religious books to be banned. If you make certain exceptions, then it's easy to allow this to happen to multiple books, which is true.
You can't make an exception for just this one item that you think is appropriate if you're making a blanket statement about a topic. I saw something in the library groups in Pennsylvania where someone was challenging their religion section about them having anything that was non-Christian. I mean, immediately all of us were like, I'm sorry, it's a nonfiction section. You have to have items that give information about all the different faiths as informational tools for other people. You're not advocating for any of them. You are providing information to the public about them. They would not be happy if a group of a different denomination of their same faith said, well, they're wrong about that particular book, so you can't have it. Or, like it's messy. And so that's why we're trying to avoid that, is by just giving access to all things within vetted reasonableness. It does beg the question, and I saw someone saying that for us to be truly neutral, we have to agree that not only do we carry things about the science of vaccines, but that we also carry the book that's arguing that vaccines don't work or cause autism, and that we have to do both. And it's like, I don't know the answer. I don't know that I agree. I get the general argument, but at the same time, how do we determine what is considered factual and what isn't? I think we may have to just give it the caveat of this is commentary, and commentary is not fact. And that might be the middle ground we have to find. It's messy.
It's hard to be neutral as a person. Is there anything that you've been generally or specifically concerned or optimistic about with what you've seen recently? Like, I know, for example, we're starting the new school year, so who knows what that will look like yet, but just where you are and what you've noticed, are you more concerned or optimistic about anything?
It seems that even nationally, I'm hearing about fewer challenges, and the challenges I'm hearing about are being shut down fairly consistently. There's pockets, Florida, Texas, and a couple in Pennsylvania, our big three involved in this beautiful game, but they're pockets. It doesn't seem to be an overriding theme that's going to be going everywhere. It doesn't seem to be expanding into areas where it wasn't before. And boards seem to more consistently be hearing the challenge, doing the reconsideration policy, and ultimately choosing not to ban. And that's promising, because that's not the direction we started out. We started out with 800 and some odd titles at York being banned. And York has reversed their decision on several of them as well. I think people seem to be learning a little bit more about how libraries actually work. And I think they're getting some more information about context. And I think the argument being made about parental rights, parents being able to choose for their own child, has been effective for some people. So I don't want to get too optimistic, but so far, I mean, I haven't seen any cases where it's been like, oh my goodness, they went there now. Like, it seems to have been tapering back the other direction.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you were hoping to cover?
I was surprised that you didn't mention ALA. and the whole hoopla over all of that. The Freedom Caucus did approach the Pennsylvania Library Association and asked them to denounce ALA. PALA did not, and their reasoning was that ALA is not a governing body that determines policy for us, and that we would not be cutting ties with them officially because they have no say over us ultimately. That's caused a little bit of just little stuff. I have not heard my boards really raising a big stink about it, but I have tried to, when we do the refresher training on intellectual freedom, I have mentioned that while we do have the ALA freedom to read statement, which we do rely on pretty heavily in that thing, in the reconsideration policy or collection development, there are also related policies written by other organizations. Association for Rural and Small Libraries has a similar one. There's a International Library Association or something. There's a bunch of different ones to pull from. And that it's also good to keep in mind that the freedom to read statement and all those were written ages ago. They were not influenced by the current elected president of the ALA, which is who they supposedly have the big issue with. So it doesn't make sense that something that's been in place since 1958 would suddenly change. And someone made a good point that the president of ALA does not make policy. We elect them, they serve a year, they help facilitate direction, but there's a board. There's not just one individual controlling everything. It scares me that you hear more and more people calling out ALA, and it makes me worry that they're coming after the field in general more.
Right. I've only just started hearing about this, so I'm not that familiar with. I heard that at least one state left ALA. I actually have spoken with an ALA person as well, and he had brought it up actually. I think I guess that just news hadn't really reached me yet.
Frankly, I find it stupid personally, not professionally stupid, because this based on the person who was elected president, the members of ALA, has self-described as a socialist at some point in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, what does that have to do with her ability to be a librarian? It's not related. And it was some time ago that that statement was made. I don't want to be held responsible for a statement I made 10 years ago. Who knows what I said back then, you know? So I just think it's a weird situation, a bad precedent to set, that we're holding someone responsible and that we're holding against them. They have a right to belong to any political party as a citizen of the United States. It is not illegal as of today to be a member of any particular political party or to support any particular political ideology. So do we really want to go that way? That's scary. Those that have mentioned the ALA situation to me, that's been the argument I've made, that as a citizen, they have a right to belong to any political party and follow any ideology, and that does not impact their ability to do their job. They were elected based on their experience as a librarian, and that needs to be the focus.
How has that gone for you? I'm just curious.
I don't engage with dumbasses. I'm going to be honest. I'm not wasting my time. Like, if you're clearly there just to get me riled up, I'm going to be like, you are absolutely right. Have a wonderful life. I'm gone. Like, I'm just not wasting my energy on that. But if it's someone who's genuinely, like, my boyfriend's stepdaughter had a question about, she very much believed that trans youth began transitioning surgeries and so forth at a young age. And she mentioned it, and I'm glad that she felt comfortable to mention it in front of us. I knew she was coming from a good place because I know her. And I was like, when do you think trans people began receiving hormone therapy? And she answered. And I was like, that's not my understanding at all. And so I do my librarian trick on the phone, and I'm like, okay, according to blah, 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 this is da-da-da. Because I knew her well enough. And I could see that she just had a misunderstanding of the facts. And I understand where she got that from because that's what you hear in the media. I knew she would listen to data from reasonable sources. People that I don't know if they're willing to do that, or if they've already demonstrated that they're just looking to get a rise, I'm not engaging with. That's not worth their energy. But even people in the library land about the ALA situation, when you remind them that someone's political affiliation has nothing to do with their ability to be a librarian, they usually go, oh yeah. So I'm like, it's a distraction. Like, it's not even the most important thing about this person. What is important is their experience, what they bring to the position, what their actual duties are, and what their actual abilities are, and the fact that they were duly elected by the members of ALA. Those should be your concerns. I don't care how they identify politically, religiously, sexually, personally. I don't care. It's none of my business because I don't want to be judged based on those things. How I identify has nothing to do with my ability to be a librarian. I think it's important for people to think of it that way. Would you want someone else treating you that way or judging your ability to do your job based on those personal aspects of yourself? Probably not. So don't do it to other people. It's not cool. I've got a couple of people that, like, online, when I've said something to that effect about her being allowed to be whatever, have whatever political leaning she wanted, the responses have either been like, oh yeah, that's true, or yeah, but not that one. Yeah,
Right.
you're entering a
Yeah.
slippery slope that I'm not playing with, baby doll. That's not a good one.
I just know of socialist to be a boogeyman word for some people, for sure.
Increasingly, I haven't done this yet, but increasingly what I want to say is, what do you think socialism is? And I think many of them don't really know. Same with communism or with even our political parties. When you ask them to define, it's a lot of gray area that people really don't know. And it's like, maybe we need to find out what being a socialist means to her, because that
Mhm.
may influence where this issue may be. It may not be the association you have with that ideology. Could be something totally different.
Yeah, in a different way. I remember like when I was an undergrad talking to a friend like about libraries in general and being like, wow, this is like one of the last free institutions that if you were to pitch today, would people be down for it? I don't know. It's just funny to think of it in other ways like that.
When you explain to people that Social Security and Medicare and a lot of these programs that have been in the United States for a long time and are very heavily relied upon, at their heart, they're socialist. They're very progressive policies that are well within that realm. So maybe it's not the boogeyman you think it is, kind of thing, you know?
That is a nuisance with the ALA thing, and hopefully that gets sorted out. The ALA person I spoke with, though, he was saying they're not going to abandon the libraries in that state if people reach out to them asking for help or whatever.
And I mean, ultimately, chair only holds a position for a certain amount of time, and yeah, they may join right back in after that. So I'm sad for libraries from that state that their state legislature made that decision on their behalf and did not offer any resources to offset that. And I'm glad that ALA is going to continue to allow them access to the necessary resources should they need them.
Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. I apologize that we had to reschedule a couple of times. Nothing is ever firm in library land. It's always pivot, pivot, pivot.
It's good to talk to people from all these different areas when I can to like get a feel for, what's actually going on in your state versus my state or even city, like it's so different in some ways.
Really is. That's the great thing about conferences. I've made really good friends with librarians across the state that I don't see them on a day-to-day basis. They're clear across the state. But when we see each other at conference, it's, like a reunion and we hang out. And I know that at any point I can reach out to them and say, hey, this thing's happening. Is this something you've ever seen? And they can give a perspective with the caveat that every community is different. But it's
Right.
helpful. It's additional support. And
Yeah.
nationwide, well, like with ARSLA and some of these other organizations, it's an opportunity to get ideas from them, but also their support when you're like, I don't have a clue what to do with this. Or the one thing we can do in the book banning situation is when someone is facing a challenge, those of us who have the means reach out to those being impacted and let them know that, I know you're going through this and it's tough. And, if you need to talk, I'm here for you. The number one thing I hear people say is that they felt so lost and so alone and under attack. So whatever support that we can offer without making it worse, but just a personal, professional, hey, I'm here for you, can go a long way.
And I've heard that if it's in your area, whether you're the public library and they're the school library, and one of you is having the attack, like if you know that you have each other's back, and like I will go sit in on your meeting and vouch for you and what you're doing, and we'll help get the community to be aware that this is happening. Sometimes meetings are not publicized what's going to be on the docket, and you don't know. If they can let you know, then you can bring people and support. Obviously, the more isolated you are, the worse off you are. So the more we can be in community with each other, supporting each other, the better off we'll be.
One thing we really risk is reacting instead of responding. And that's when things get said that get taken out of context and then someone gets lambasted and things like that, which is why it's so important to have the policies and procedures and the trainings in place to begin with, so that we're coming from a place of responding rather than reacting. Reactions are tied to emotions. Responses are more considered, and that can make a huge difference in the entire process.
Yeah, I'm also somebody who's not necessarily. I've tried to be more logical with my arguments, but it's easy to get emotional and then it's all over because you're upset. So like nothing is productive happening.
I work from home probably 90% of the time, and my poor boyfriend has heard so many times of like me in here just like growling basically. And then I'll come out and I'll be like, I just need to rant about this. You don't need to understand what I'm saying. You don't need to respond. I just need to rant. And I will rant and I will imagine my response that I would make. And then after I take a deep breath, I can go back and type the professional email that does not include all of that, but you still got to get it out. So finding that safe space to get it out so that you can then transition into the less emotional response. It's not easy.
So do you work for a library at home then?
Yeah, so
does-
I'm the system admin, and
Okay.
so I help the 9 member libraries work together well, set policy and procedure, facilitate their limited resources, all that kind of stuff. I'm very fortunate. It actually has worked out really great.
Yeah, thanks again for your time, and I really
Anytime.
appreciate talking with you.
Always available. Have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. See you as well.